Good afternoon and welcome to today's hearing where we're going to hear from a number of parties regarding the proof of storage concept proposal that was filed by members of our energy storage work group back in January. I believe it was January 14th. As our new team leader of this work group, Judge Kristen Lawrence said in her January 14th report to the Commission, there are tremendous benefits associated with the potential for energy storage, and I think we're seeing that begin to roll out throughout the country. I've heard Secretary of Energy Rick Perry refer to it as the Holy Grail that will unlock even more renewables, and we've heard from our friends at PPRP. They've been referring to it as the Swiss Army knife. And for those who haven't seen the PPRP report, Energy Storage Report, I'd bring that to your attention. It was issued just a few months back in December, and it's quite a great resource. I want to thank all the members of the work group who have been participating for the past 2 years with the assistance of first Andrew Johnston and now Judge Kristen Lawrence. I know a lot of substantial effort has been put into producing the proposal that we now have before us. That said, I recognize that this is a non-consensus proposal. We'll hear from parties today that continue to have concerns, I expect. And part of today's hearing is to listen to those concerns, to have the commissioners ask some questions regarding whether or not this framework, I recognize that these are not the projects, but how this framework could be possibly improved or changed before the Commission passes judgment. So before we begin, and I turn it over to Judge Lawrence to make introductions and kick off the panels, I personally would like to hear from the parties on a number of issues today. Number one being whether there is sufficient detail in the current proposal before us, and whether it's been sufficiently crafted to avoid a conflict with our current PUA statute requiring that there be a functional separation between utilities and the ownership of generation, sales, or supply of the commodity. Along those same lines, I recognize, and OPC pointed out in their initial memo, that we do have legislation currently pending that looks very similar to the storage proposal before us. I've tried to compare this proposal before the PSC and the current legislation, and to the extent that there are changes, if you could bring those to my attention, I would appreciate that. And I'd also like to hear about whether or not at this early stage we need to have some type of cost effectiveness, cost benefit analysis. I recognize that some would argue that we should save that for the next stage when we actually have actual proposals before us, where an actual or a more accurate cost-benefit test would be able to be placed on a particular project, or if that's something we should provide a more rough estimate at this stage before the four utilities go forward and select their two projects. So those are where I'd like to end, having some of those questions answered when we conclude at or before 5 p.m. today. But I do look forward to hearing from the various parties and interests. Do other commissioners have any opening comments before we begin? Commissioner O'Donnell.
Just to say that I share, Mr. Chairman, your thoughts with regard to cost effectiveness, so I have some questions in my mind along those lines as well. And, you know, basically, if we are to go down this path now or soon, is that a pre-decision, or I want to question whether or not it's a pre-decision on whatever costing data is eventually provided to us, because that concerns me, kind of going down a path but not having a sense of what the costing is going to be. So that's all I had.
With that, I will turn it over to Judge Kristen Lawrence. Good afternoon.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Chairman, Commissioners. My name is Kristen Lawrence. Since November of last year, I've been acting in the capacity as Energy Storage Working Group Leader. Prior to my involvement, the work group produced a memorandum on key energy storage issues to support the study of energy storage that was conducted by the Maryland Department of Natural Resources Power Plant Research Program. That the Chairman mentioned, PPRP's report was issued in December and was made a part of this docket, and the working group's memo is appended to that report. Subsequent to PPRP's report on January 14, 2019, the work group submitted the Proof of Regulatory Concept Program proposal that we're here on today. The Proof of Regulatory Concept Program is intended to test innovative regulatory and business models for energy storage. The proposal was developed initially by the Energy Storage Association and was revised with input from other participants in the working group. When it was docketed on January 14, included with the proposal was a letter in support of the proposal from the Joint Utilities, Baltimore Gas and Electric, Potomac Electric Power Company, and Delmarva Power and Light Company, and a letter from the Maryland Energy Administration with its comments on the proposal. The Office of People's Counsel provided comments at the time of the final review of the proposal, but declined to have its written comments submitted at that time. The Commission issued a notice of this hearing on February 21, 2019, inviting interested parties to file written comments by March 1 and reply comments by March 8. Numerous parties filed comments. In addition to what was submitted with the proposal, the Joint Utilities and MEA submitted additional written comments, and OPC submitted its comments. Comments were also filed by third-party storage manufacturers, project developers, other utilities, Potomac Edison, industry associations, and other organizations. The comments were largely favorable, some with recommendations for minor modifications, although OPC and MEA expressed concerns that they will share with you. As PPRP noted in its report on energy storage in Maryland, Maryland is the first and so far the only state to enact an income tax credit for storage systems. This tax credit program went into effect on January 1, 2018. Through this program, MEA provides a tax credit on the installed costs of storage systems for both residential and commercial customers. The state put that program into effect to incentivize development of energy storage systems, and the work group's proposal serves to further the state's goal of promoting use of energy storage. As I'm sure you know, advanced energy storage is different from traditional resources. It's extremely flexible, can integrate variable renewable resources, can be used to reduce peak demand and time shift energy usage, can be used to defer infrastructure investments, can assist with frequency regulation and provide grid stabilization, and it can provide backup power in times of outages. Is this flexibility, the fact that energy storage can be used in so many different ways, that makes energy storage so beneficial to the grid? But the many different uses of storage and its many varying attributes are also what makes it difficult to fit into the existing regulatory framework. A regulatory framework that was developed before these types of energy resources that exist today were even available, and a regulatory framework that separates into generation and distribution functions. Instead of trying to fit storage into the existing regulatory framework, the work group put forth the proposal as a way of obtaining information and solutions as to how to best promote energy storage, including the regulatory reforms that might be needed. As PPRP pointed out in its energy storage report, in order for energy storage to be most efficient and therefore most cost effective, it shouldn't be limited to one use or one application. Instead, there needs to be value stacking. While recognizing that receiving compensation for multiple value streams is key to storage economics, PPRP went on to say, many of the benefits of storage result in system-wide cost savings, but have no recognized market value. From a developer's perspective, storage projects may not be economically justified unless more of these benefits are monetized by policymakers, regulators, and/or PJM. What might be required to promote energy storage, given its unique and complex functionality, is a more insightful approach to the appropriate cost-effectiveness analysis. It may not be advisable to require proof that a pilot project will produce known benefits above its known costs, particularly if that project is limited in its applications. If pilot projects are limited in application and benefits are not stacked, then what can be learned from those pilot projects might also be limited. The work group acknowledges that the proposal does not provide all of the factors that will be included in subsequent individual applications for specific pilot projects. The proposal provided that cost estimates and details on cost recovery mechanisms would be part of individual applications filed after this. And one of the purposes of this hearing, again, since energy storage is so unique, is to highlight what additional details will be needed in those subsequent applications, should the Commission direct utilities to go forward from this point. With that, I will turn it over to the Energy Storage Association.
Thank you, Judge. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Chair Stanek, Commissioners. Thank you for the opportunity to provide comments in front of you today in support of the Proof of Regulatory Concept program that the work group submitted in January. My name is Nissan Goldberger. I'm the State Policy Director with the Energy Storage Association. We're the National Trade Association for Energy Storage. We're based out of Washington, D.C., and we represent approximately 170 members that are deploying energy storage from utilities, developers, manufacturers, independent power producers, and software companies. Our technologies that we represent are as varied as our membership, from pumped hydro and flywheels on the one end to ice storage and batteries on the other. In my comments today, I'd like to reiterate what Judge Lawrence articulated in terms of the value proposition for energy storage, what other states are doing to break down the regulatory barriers for energy storage in the state, and how the Proof of Regulatory Concept program in front of you today fits into that framework. So Judge Lawrence articulated this perfectly. I'll just reiterate and underscore that what makes energy storage so potentially transformational for the electric system is its ability to toggle and shift between generation, distribution service, and transmission services almost instantaneously and from the same asset. But that very complexity also makes it very difficult to fit into the existing regulatory framework that was created without energy storage in mind, largely in most states. And so what that means is that we really have to think about whether there's any room for a regulatory reform to better accommodate energy storage that doesn't typecast it into only one single application and single value stream. The benefits of storage in terms of stacking different values and different services with one asset serves two very important public policy benefits. Number one, if an energy storage asset is able to provide multiple services, then it's not sitting there providing only one application, and it provides greatest value and optimal value for ratepayers. So instead of just serving peak demand 20 days of the year, it can provide different services throughout the year, meaning that no additional assets are needed. Instead, one asset can be used. And number two, because there's only more than one value stream to pencil out the economics of the asset, and more energy storage assets can be deployed cost effectively because it's capturing more revenues and more values to make the economics work out for more systems. And so recognizing that there are some regulatory reforms that are needed to accommodate this type of multiple application, multiple use, multiple ownership frameworks, a number of states have taken action to facilitate this. I'll note that California and New York have both launched pilot programs testing non-wires alternatives, calling the utilities to solicit for non-wires alternative solutions for distribution investment. And those projects have been used in similar ways to the models that we have today in the proposal. I'll note that those two states have also facilitated mechanisms for the utilities to be agnostic to whether they own the energy storage asset by providing various mechanisms for recovering earning a rate of return on the contracts in lieu of rate basing the asset. California, New York, and Massachusetts have all clarified rules around ownership for energy storage. Most notably in Massachusetts, law in 2016 clarified under the definition of energy storage that utilities may own it. New Hampshire and Texas are exploring legislation this year to do the same. And then finally, commissions in New Hampshire and Vermont have approved pilot programs that allow for the virtual power plant model that's in front of you today to be implemented by the utilities, allowing customers to bring their own battery, as it's called, BYOB, and provide grid benefits to the utility in exchange for an on-bill credit that forgoes traditional distribution investment. So it's within the context of those types of actions that we're seeing across the country that the working group collaboratively developed the four models in front of you today. They're not intended to be exhaustive of the types of commercial arrangements that you may see or can see in the state of Maryland, but they're recognizing the fact that there are some innovative regulatory and commercial solutions to deploying storage that facilitate this multiple application, multiple ownership framework, and that this pilot program may may provide the Commission, if approved, with the targeted and short-term learnings of the types of issues that come up with it and types of benefits that come up with these models to determine whether action is needed beyond the pilot to facilitate these kinds of models across the state. So I thank you for your consideration and your time today. I look forward to the discussion this afternoon.
Thank you. Judge, did we want to just go down the line, or?
Yes,
Okay.
if you have the agenda, I think they're sitting in the order in which you hope to speak from.
Okay. We'll move from your right to left.
Okay. So good afternoon, Chairman Stanek and members of the Commission. My name is Susan Moore, and I'm Director of Utility Initiatives for Exelon. As Exelon's Director of Utility Initiatives, I provide strategic energy policy support to Exelon's 6 electric utilities. I'm here today with my colleagues from Baltimore Gas and Electric, PEPCO, and Delmarva Power to express our strong support for the Energy Storage Work Group's Proof of Regulatory Concept program proposal and answer any questions. I hope you will allow me to defer to my colleagues from the utilities for some of the specific questions that might come up, because they're more familiar with the situation in Maryland, I think. As the technical capabilities continue to advance and its costs to fall, battery storage technology has the capacity to significantly alter the way the electric grid advances to reliably and affordably meet the evolving needs of electric customers. Utility companies must learn not only the system impacts and technical capabilities of battery storage, but also the intricacy of engaging in new business models that allow for its value to be maximized. To this end, the proposed pilot program, if approved, will provide new and innovative ways to engage with energy storage developers and our customers to leverage potential value streams and benefits that battery storage can offer. The Commission, electric customers, Maryland's energy storage market stakeholders, and utility companies all stand to benefit broadly from the learnings expected from implementation of this proposed pilot program. The joint utilities were active and supportive participants of the PC44 Energy Storage Work Group, working closely with stakeholders through the group's process in framing, discussing, developing, and refining the proposals. We'd like to compliment the work group leader, Judge Lawrence, for preparing the filing and for the Commission for considering it. The joint utilities support the proposed pilot program for 4 key reasons. First, this proposed pilot program is the result of a thorough and collaborative effort of a widely varied group of stakeholders. The Commission has a unique opportunity before it to advance a pilot program that is universally supported by the state's investor-owned utilities and by the nation's leading distributed energy resource providers. Just a side note on that, we had one-on-one conversations with 7 of the nation's leading energy storage providers, and if you have questions about some of those conversations and some of the opinions they expressed about this program, I'd be glad to try to qualify some of the learnings we received from them. Second, this proposed pilot program presents an opportunity to not only glean important technical learnings about the performance of batteries as a grid reliability solution, but also to better understand how a variety of ownership and operation models would allow energy storage to be deployed to meet grid reliability needs while optimizing the value of storage to electric utility customers. Third, this proposed pilot program has been structured such that a variety of Maryland energy storage market stakeholders have the opportunity to own and operate batteries. As currently envisioned, each of the state's 4 investor-owned utilities would commit to test 2 of the 4 business models. These 4 business models allow for utility ownership of batteries as a grid asset and for the grid reliability use of batteries owned by third parties and by commercial and residential customers. Through this proposed pilot program, new utility cost recovery methodologies can be developed that allow third-party owned storage reliability applications to be on a level playing field with traditional distribution assets in that non-wires alternative construct that we're hearing discussed across the country. This proposed pilot program would generate a myriad of information that will be essential to analyze the most useful ways to deploy batteries in Maryland in the years to come. This includes analyzing a variety of technologies and business models and determining the cost effectiveness of those models to assure that in the future batteries are deployed in a way that optimizes their value to electricity customers. Additionally, I'd like to note that the business models included in the proposal have been discussed with leading national energy storage developers who have executed similar models in other jurisdictions and have indicated interest in participating in these applications in Maryland. Finally, it's important to make clear that the proposal before the Commission seeks approval only for the program concept and framework. If the proposal is approved, the utility companies will develop and bring to the Commission specific project applications based on the business models contained in the proposal. The Commission and stakeholders will have the opportunity at that time to review these applications, offer input and feedback, and analyze project-specific information about cost estimates, expected benefits, reporting metrics, and operational mechanics. In other words, approval of the pilot proposal before the Commission does not foreclose future opportunities for all stakeholders to provide input for the Commission to exercise oversight. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I'd be glad to
Ms.
answer
Moore.
questions.
We'll save questions for the end. We'll allow everybody to make their opening statement. Counsel for People's Counsel.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman, Commissioners. Joseph Cleaver on behalf of OPC. Your Honors, I'll try to keep it brief because we've provided initial comments and reply comments. OPC has no objection to deployment of storage assets on the distribution system, provided that they represent a cost-effective alternative to a reliability issue on the system. In fact, OPC supports deployment of storage assets, provided that they meet that standard. OPC also has no objection to cost projections, including revenues expected from participation in wholesale markets or other revenue streams being factored into that cost-effective analysis. Our main concern with the proposal as drafted is the absence of a cost-effectiveness requirement, especially when considered alongside the lack of any cost projections for the program as a whole or for individual projects. With respect to the legal issues, we agree with the former work group leader's memo that the law is unclear, but in light of the prohibitions set forth in 7509, we think it's at least arguable that if a storage asset doesn't represent a cost-effective alternative to a traditional T&D upgrade, that it would run afoul of the law. With respect to the Chairman's question regarding the difference between what's been proposed before the Commission and House Bill 650, I would note in that regard with respect to the legal issue, House Bill 650 is proposed to become PUA 7216. In Section G, the House bill is very clear that for purposes of this program only set forth in the statute, that an investor-owned utility may own storage. I think the implication there is that there is a concern on the part of the General Assembly that outside of the program set forth in 7216 that legal issues could arise. And that, to answer Your Honor's question, is a difference between House Bill 650 and what's been proposed here. Also, with respect to cost effectiveness in responding to the Chairman's question and to Commissioner O'Donnell's question, I suppose it is possible for the Commission to state that we'll determine cost effectiveness and whether we want to require that at a later date. We're not being asked to approve that here, but of course, if the Commission were to approve the program as proposed now, and then one of the utilities were to come with a program that doesn't meet the standard that OPC has articulated, that would be a lot of regulatory resources to look at something only to have the Commission in the end say, actually, we did want something to be cost effective. And so for that reason, OPC's position would be that the cost effectiveness requirement should be included in whatever the Commission approves at this stage. Beyond the legal concerns, Your Honor, we simply oppose the approval of a program whose overall costs and component project costs are unknown when ratepayers will be paying for that program. And for these reasons, we also oppose the alternative cost recovery mechanisms that are discussed in the ESA proposal as possible alternatives. We agree with Potomac Edison in that regard that if the commission were to approve something, that those issues should be decided at a later date. A few other concerns quickly. We noted the need for stakeholder involvement in project selection process, the need for additional clarity on the sunset provision, and the need for clear metrics. We would submit on the comments on those matters. We share many of the concerns of several stakeholders, including MEA, Potomac Edison to some degree, WGL Energy. We largely share the concerns of staff, and we would, if the recommendations of staff were to be adopted by the Commission, we think that that would be result in an acceptable proposal. Again, we support the deployment of energy storage on the distribution system in the state, but we think that the pilot program should be revised to require a cost-effectiveness standard, some estimate of cost projections, and a standard for approval tailored to the requirements of PUA Section 7509. Thank you, Your Honor.
Thank you. Dr. Opsahl.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman, Commissioners. Thank you for allowing Maryland Energy Administration this opportunity to provide testimony on the ESA draft proposal and the later proof of regulatory concept program. My name is Ryan Opsahl. I'm a policy manager for MEA. As I begin, I would like to thank the Energy Storage Association for its ardent and faithful attempts to bridge gaps between the various stakeholders involved. MEA is very appreciative of that hard work. Nevertheless, despite improvements to program in certain areas, MEA does maintain 4 key concerns regarding the storage proposal in its current iteration. First, we do take issue with the joint utilities' opaque language regarding their needs for these projects vis-a-vis a cost-benefit analysis. Although emphasis on this point was withdrawn from a later draft, it is still important to understand the utilities' cost-benefit processes when making determinations on such storage projects, especially given that the storage facility in Cold Springs apparently passed such an internal cost-benefit analysis. A clear understanding of why certain projects are approved is critical to moving forward in our determinations regarding the viability and effectiveness of ratepayer-funded materials and their inclusion in pilot program. Second, Maryland Energy Administration notes that there remain questions surrounding whether a utility-only model is wholly consistent with the legal framework in place in Maryland. All parties are familiar with this concern, consistent with and replicated in states with bifurcated markets where on one side it is unregulated and the other it is regulated. The fact that storage devices both draw power from the grid and are able to disperse power to the grid puts them in a regulatory gray zone. The question is the how to treat these devices as either grid-only assets or generation devices is a difficult one, not without long-term ramifications for both components of the market. I would also like to state, nowhere in our comments do we state that the utilities should not be able to own storage assets. MEA is very clear that our primary concern rests with regulated utilities having access to the wholesale market where they will be able to take advantage of highly profitable arbitrage opportunities. Third, this proposal continues to lack meaningful cost projections. Certainly it is accurate that more precise cost estimates cannot be determined until the program progresses, and we can account for things like ownership style, device type, location, their primary function, and so on. At this stage, we do not expect that level of precision. Nevertheless, some cost estimate or cost range should be provided, so we know what Maryland's ratepayers will be roughly expected to pay. Finally, the sunset provision is a welcome addition to the proposal. In previous oral and written comments on various pilot proposals, MEA has consistently brought up the need for such sunsetting requirements. However, the provision in this proposal is unclear. MEA does not understand to what exactly the sunset applies. The physical storage assets will be deployed and operational. It is unlikely they will be decommissioned. So does the provision apply to data collection and reporting or something else? If so, the state would be forgoing access to valuable data, which is a great concern. Clarification on this provision would be appreciated. MEA is supportive of the deployment of energy storage assets in the state. Nevertheless, we do not want additional costs placed on Maryland's ratepayers without good cause and proper protections. Thank you, and I welcome any questions you may have.
Thank you, Dr. Opsahl. Mr. Bonikowski, does staff have a presentation?
Not a formal presentation, Mr. Chairman. We just have a few key points related to the comments that we had filed. With that, Good afternoon, Chairman and Commissioners. Matt Bykowski on behalf of the Commission's technical staff. Staff is generally supportive of the proof of regulatory concept filed in this case. We would note on the cost-benefit analysis, there is currently no rough cost estimate or cost estimate in any form for what this program would run. There also is not a requirement for cost-benefit analysis to be conducted. These are both concerns that staff has. We find it difficult to evaluate the risk that may be posed to ratepayers given absence of both of these data. As such, staff recommends that the utilities be required to submit a cost-benefit analysis for all programs for the Commission's consideration. We would also note that in case 9361, PEPCO had proposed a microgrid project that included battery storage, and that a cost-benefit analysis was included in that case, so it should be possible for this type of analysis to be produced and considered. Staff is generally supportive of a diversity in the project types. We feel there's value in exploring these different ownership models, although we do have some concerns that the utilities may opt to only select the multi-use project types. As such, staff would recommend requiring utilities to select at least one project in either the third-party ownership or virtual power plant categories.
So, Mr. Bonikowski, when you say the multi-use, it's staff's belief that the utilities would only select Model 1, utility only, and Model 2, utility and third party?
That is a concern that we have, yes. With respect to the timeline in the proposal, the proposal envisions a 3-year program. Year 1 would be proposal solicitation, contract negotiations, and applications to the Commission. We're concerned that this may not provide enough time for analysis and review. We would note in prior cases, particularly in that case 9361 with PEPCO, that the analysis took about a week short of a full year from the time the proposal was submitted until the Commission order was issued. So we feel there may be additional time needed for application review. We're also concerned that limiting data collection to only 1 year leaves the program susceptible to weather variance. Extending the evaluation period up to 3 years, we feel, would provide for a more robust data set. That way you're not running into, in the first year, you had either abnormally warm or cool weather that's resulting in improper evaluation of the benefits of storage. Staff also recognizes the concerns of other parties with respect to the metrics and the need to ensure that data is collected consistently and effectively and can be used to reach a meaningful conclusion. Staff has engaged in work groups in the past in both the Empower program and AMI project evaluation, developing reporting templates through the work group process. And we found that having a standardized report template agreed to by all parties is an effective means of ensuring, again, effective program evaluation at the end, and we would recommend a similar process in this case. With that, we're available to answer any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Bonikowski. We've read the reply briefs and the initial briefs that the parties have pre-filed. Your opening statements hew very closely to those comments there. I'd just like to begin with one question and then open it up to the other commissioners. We've heard from People's Council, Commission trial staff, as well as the Maryland Energy Administration with respect to concerns that there are no cost estimates, that the proposal set forth doesn't provide any requirement. I recognize that the program will be contained relatively small, between 5 and 10 megawatts at the maximum across all 4 IOU's service territories. So that being said, perhaps there's a cap in that respect. But is there any concern or opposition to including a requirement or a marker that would require the utilities to provide some cost-benefit standard or requirement at this early stage, and then when the actual project is filed, it would be refined and we would have a better estimate of how much this project would cost? So either the utilities...
I can start. I think one of the things that's unique about this pilot is that right now, when utilities look at deploying storage as a grid reliability asset, there aren't the number of applications, when you look at it just as the deferral of a traditional investment, that are available are limited. We understand that dynamic is changing as the price of storage comes down, but a lot of the dependence on whether or not they pencil is very specific to the location and the traditional solution that you're substituting for, which is one of the reasons why it's difficult until you identify the specific locations and applications for the storage as a grid reliability need to know what the benefit is from a cost-benefit perspective, because you're not sure what traditional asset you're substituting for. So that's number one. I think when we get into the application process where we're looking at specific places to put the storage that we want to pilot it, that's when we're going to have a much more granular idea of the traditional asset that's being replaced and the costs associated with that. We would definitely want to do our utmost to try to get very crisp on that type of analysis, understanding what the traditional investment would have cost, what the installation of the battery would cost. But that gets down to a very locational specific discussion about what you're replacing, what the interconnection costs of everything are in that particular location.
And I think the parties to your left recognize that the
Right.
granularity and the specificity with respect to the costs will come when the project is selected, what type of project it is, where it's going to be located. But what is the argument against providing some general markers at this early stage at program approval with respect to providing some, and I think the parties to your left would recognize that these would be a rough estimate at this point. What's the argument against providing that data?
I think the argument against providing that data is that it's going to be it would be extremely rough. A, because you don't know the cost that you're replacing, and B, one of the things that comes out of the pilot potentially in terms of the learnings you're getting out of that is the benefit side of the equation. That benefit is in terms of the savings versus the traditional investment. It's also in terms of how the revenues from these additional value streams that you're stacking on top come in and benefit the ratepayers under the different business models. Right now, wholesale revenues are not particularly robust, and so when you look at those as but that market can change, and so I think there's some hesitation on both the cost side and the benefit side to come up with a broad generalization until we have a really good idea of where we would be looking at doing the applications and what business model would be employed. I don't know if maybe Nitsan can speak also to, because I know that ESA did try to do some broad cost-benefit analysis.
Well, I wonder if there's a difference here between overall program cost estimates and cost effectiveness on a project-by-project basis. The proposal, and this maybe wasn't clearly articulated in the proposal, but it was certainly discussed among stakeholders, was an agreement that every application would provide exact estimates to the different value streams and the different costs of the program, so that on a project-by-project basis you would be able to determine whether there's the potential for net benefit, recognizing, of course, that during the process of the pilot we will recognize and learn whether those wholesale market revenues will actually materialize and be what we thought they were. So that's the incentive to move the cost effectiveness analysis to the application stage is predicated on the notion that that will be very project specific. That does not mean that we can't get guidance in this at this stage of what those values should be and what those costs and components should be. But to the earlier point on overall program costs, if it's a virtual power plant proposal that relies exclusively on customer-owned or third-party-owned resources, the cost of the utility is very different than a 1 megawatt distribution or substation storage asset. And so trying to make a calculation for what those 5 to 10 megawatts will look in terms of an overall program cost is difficult.
Let me ask the other parties at the table if we could turn this question on its head. It appears that Exelon and the Energy Storage Association saying it's too premature at this point to provide any cost effectiveness, cost benefit ratios. Any information that would be provided could be a very wide range and perhaps not instructive when the actual projects are submitted. So the question is, what's the harm? Why can't we wait till the actual specific model, the design, location is determined, and then provide the cost-benefit information. Any of the three of you. Mr. Cleaver.
Yeah. Okay, I'll take a stab at it, Your Honor. Thank you. Your Honor, with respecting the responses that Your Honor got to your first question, I mean, we know for a fact that BGE has deployed a storage facility on its system at the Cold Spring Lane facility that's been mentioned in the comments and that we've heard a lot about. So, when the company made the decision to deploy that, presumably it engaged in some kind of analysis as to what the costs of the deferred system upgrade were, what the costs of the asset were, because presumably we're going to see this in the company's next electric base rate case, and I would have to assume that the company undertook an analysis to determine why this project was cost effective and why it chose the project. So with this, with the four models that are set forth in the program, there must be some sense from the companies that are going to be engaging in these in this pilot program as to what maybe another project that it has in mind, what that would cost, what the benefits may be. It doesn't seem, based on the fact that we know that at least one utility in the state has already engaged in this process and made a decision and taken action, we don't understand why that can't be undertaken now. And in terms of why does it have to be done now, I mean, again, I would say something similar to what I said about cost effectiveness to Commissioner O'Donnell's point. If the Commission were to approve this pilot program and then get proposals from the company that are just completely out of line with what maybe Your Honors anticipated when you saw this, and they're rejected, there may be some challenge from the company saying, well, you approved the program and that was never a requirement. And so that's a reason that we, in our view, that it should be provided now, and that's also, from what I said about the Cold Spring project, is why we think it's something that could at least be done on a rough basis now.
Can I try to just respond a little bit to that? And that is that I was not involved in the Cold Spring decision, and if you want to talk about Cold Spring, I'll bring up somebody from BG who can speak specifically to that. But in the case of Cold Spring, that is effectively a storage system being used only for grid distribution at this point. If this pilot program was proposing that the utility find each utility find two places to execute Model 1, the utility owns it and operates it, it'd be easier to come up with a cost number. But if we were to have gone into Cold Spring knowing that these other business models were available to us, as they would be in the pilot, a VPP approach, or issuing a contract to a third party who has a storage asset behind the meter, or at one C&I customer or so forth, that would have significantly changed the dynamics in terms of the price of the project. And so to us, part of the complication here is that I think when the utilities are going to go and select projects to put forward as a pilot, they're going to find first a grid reliability need, because that predicates everything. Is there a grid reliability need? And then once they have the location for that, they're going to go out to a competitive process and speak to developers and try to weigh off the different business models and see which ones people have interest in executing with us, whether they want to go with a VPP solution or they're advising us to go with the utility only model and so forth. And that's significantly going to alter the price in that location because of the different cost structures associated with the different models.
So, Ms. Mora, I guess having a little bit of a hard time, because are you suggesting that this project has this pilot has a time frame of 3 years, and the first year you're going to propose them and get them approved, and at some point you're going to get them built, all within 3 years, and after 3 years we're going to have evaluation. Do I have that correct?
Well,
under the proposal?
And I heard what the staff suggested in terms of extending the application review period and extending the amount of time used for collecting information. I believe in our reply comments, we acknowledge that that might be something worth doing in terms of extending those
Right,
periods
but
of
under
time.
the current proposal,
Under the current
it's
proposal.
3 years between the time, let's say we issue a decision tomorrow approving this, moving this framework, and then within 3 years, we're going to have projects up and running and we're going to have evaluation. And in that first year, under the current proposal, you're going to make the application and presumably maybe even begin construction. Do I have that right?
That is right, and I think that's actually reasonable. If we can identify.
Right. So if you think that's reasonable, are you telling me that you have no projects in mind that you couldn't, that you, you must have some projects in mind where you have grid issues. I can't imagine that you're just, like, we have no idea. We're going to just go out there and say, oh, now we got this approved, we're going to go and look for where we might have a project. So is it not possible to, I find it highly likely that you have some ideas where you might want to put these, and is it not possible to provide all these parties in the commission with a range of costs? It could cost between X and Y, because, I think there's obviously concern with, are we talking about 1.5 million? Are we talking about 10 million? Are we talking about 100 million? I mean, we've got nothing, right? Nothing. So, that makes it difficult for the commission to be able to say, sure, go ahead, and then it comes up and it's $100 million, and we had no idea. We thought it was going to be $5 to $10 million.
Let me try to answer those in some kind of order. Yes, there probably are locations in mind in the individual utilities where they know they have grid reliability needs, and they're thinking that if this pilot comes through, that might be a good location to go out to market and go through the competitive process of interviewing market participants, getting their input on which models they think would work in that particular location. That's going to be dependent, in the case of a VPP, on what kind of assets are already available behind the meter for customers that they could work to aggregate and so forth. So I think you're right. There probably are locations already in mind in the utilities, and we have some idea perhaps of what the traditional investment would be to address those needs. I think where you're going to get a lot of variability is in the solution set in terms of the price of the solution, given the 4 different business models that could be applied.
Well, sure. I mean, and I think you're hearing everybody acknowledging that variability, is understood. But again, what kind of range of cost are we talking about? I think that's really where, I can speak for myself that I have some question as to what kind of cost are we talking about that are going to be borne by the ratepayers, and so that's a whole question I have, and I just I find it. I would suspect that there are some ideas out there about how much some of these projects might cost. So that's my comment on that issue. I'll stop and let my other commissioners go. I have some other questions, but I'll keep going afterwards.
I'm not sure where to start on this, but I can say this. We wouldn't have created PC44 in this particular aspect of PC44 if we didn't want these projects to be tested and to go forth. Having said that, you're hearing some questions about, okay, what's the right way to do it? And I want to give you 2 examples of where that maybe didn't work so well with this kind of stuff. One was right before I got here, although my appointment had been announced, I wasn't here yet. And there was a presentation by Baltimore Gas and Electric that I watched on the streaming. I was probably one of 3 people on the earth that were watching our streaming. But it was a presentation by Baltimore Gas and Electric of a microgrid pilot. And needless to say, if there are any folks in the room from BG&E who were here that day, it didn't go swimmingly well. It didn't go swimmingly well on the other end of the streaming video, for sure. And I'm sure Commissioner Richard would agree, he was here, that didn't go too well that day. And then there was a second one. It was actually one when I was here as a result of a merger of Exelon and the PHI companies, where the commission ordered a proposal for a microgrid to be brought forth as a result of the merger, and it was. And again, it didn't go so well in the end. It wasn't approved, for sure, but there was a lot of effort expended to try to get that going forward. And the reason I tell those 2 stories is part of this process is to make sure that we have enough information to make good decisions and to do it at the right time. So here's my question. Let me ask the ESA, Ms. Goldberger. You work with a lot of states, right? Some of these projects have gone forward. Could you, at this stage, provide conceptual cost estimates? Like, here's what this project in Pennsylvania cost, or this project in California cost, or like kind of a range of what the costs are to give us a sense, get us in the ballpark here?
Commissioner O'Donnell, in the working group, I actually did provide, on one given day, I believe in February of 2018, I provided some informal information about the current cost assumptions that a number of consultancies have put forward and gave the stakeholders a sense of the approximate range. I'd be happy as a follow-up to try and find publicly available data of projects that have been deployed across the country. Again, I won't have insight into the different revenue streams that are available to them. I'm certainly happy as a follow-up to cite publicly available data in terms of overall projects cost that might be similar projects in the 1 to 2 megawatt range, primarily functioning as a distribution deferral asset. I'm happy to take that on.
I think what you're hearing from up here, and especially the joint utilities need to know this, we're not asking something we're going to audit you to. We're asking, give us a sense. What kind of decisions are we making? What path are we heading down with regard to potential liabilities for the ratepayers? And I think that has to be, it has to be there. It has to be out there somewhere. Okay. And speaking of revenue streams, I noted that the working group, and maybe this is for Judge Lawrence, the working group has not yet identified which mechanism to propose to the commission in regards to service contracts and how to determine a return on those. Specifically on page 8, the second paragraph, it describes that. Do you know if the working group was planning on giving us that information, and if so, when?
It's my understanding that that is also something that would be provided in the specific applications for specific projects. But because, again, the revenue streams would be different depending on the business model that's ultimately chosen.
Yeah.
Cost would be.
I'm sure you would appreciate, though, that for us, it's like there's what's behind the curtains. You know, what's going to be presented to us when we get to the PHI microgrid presentation or the BG&E microgrid. What's going to happen that day? What are we going to see? Are we going to be surprised? Are we going to be disappointed? Or what's coming?
Well, I think what the proposal tried to do was set out the alternatives based on the business models, and then the individual applications would, hone in on those more closely.
I can take a stab at that. The working group explored through multiple meetings the different mechanisms that states are exploring to make a utility agnostic to whether or not they own the energy storage asset, including various types of rates of return. I am not a thought leader in this space, but we actually invited 2 thought leaders to present on the different types of mechanisms that California and New York and other states are exploring. There was disagreement among the work group members and stakeholders about whether or not this is an appropriate component to include in the proposal, and we therefore did not come forward with a recommendation on a specific mechanism because it is so state-specific and something that I think the stakeholders in the working group would have appreciated input from you all on. I think that the idea was that this would be something that would be included ultimately in an application, but preferably discussed and provided guidance in this session.
Right, but I'm trying to elicit some help here with not approving something in concept, traveling down a long road to get to a presentation of specifics, and then the specifics don't go anywhere because we didn't have enough information up front to make the appropriate decision. So, and I don't feel like I'm getting there with this line of question, but that's okay. I'll let it go for now. We might get some more later. Ms. Moore, I did want to ask you one more question. OPC, indicates in their presentation that we need a statutory change to accommodate the ownership that Ms. Goldberger was just talking about for these assets. Do you agree with that, or do you disagree with that?
Actually, my reading of what OPC said in its comments is we're in agreement that right now we are permitted to own energy storage as a grid reliability asset. Every one of these models is predicated on the assumption that there's a grid reliability need for the asset, which would be its primary purpose. What changes from one model to another is how you stack additional functionality for the battery on top of that primary purpose use as a grid reliability asset. So I don't believe there's a need for statutory change. As I understood the comment that I saw in the OPC was that they were affirming that they do agree that as a grid reliability asset.
So let me clarify then with OPC. You referenced the bill that's in Annapolis now, and you referenced the fact that it's clarification language makes the implication that it's not allowed now because it specifically does allow it in that provision. Is that your position? And could you comment on what Exelon just said?
Generally, Your Honor, I think that, our view is that as 7509 is presently drafted, assuming no further clarification to the statute, OPC's view is that if a storage asset is being used to offset or to meet a need on the distribution system and it's cost effective, that would not run afoul of 7509. However, if it's being used for some other reason, or if it's being used to offset a need on the system, but it's not cost effective, or it costs more as compared to the traditional upgrade, then it begs the question, well, what is the primary purpose of it? What are you using it for? And under that scenario, if that standard that we've articulated or recommended is not met, at that point, I think it very well could be in violation of 7509. I would note that Your Honor mentioned House Bill 650. I would note that House Bill 650 expressly allows projects that are not cost-effective. It says priority will be given to cost-effective projects, but non-cost-effective projects could be approved. But because House Bill 650 makes that statement that for purposes of this program only, a utility can own storage, OPC didn't view the statute as problematic because we view that as a legislative exception to 7509, even though that what would be 7216, House Bill 650, would allow non-cost-effective projects because it would be a legislative statutory exception to 7509. We didn't raise that issue in opposition in our comments on the legislation.
I see. Thank you both.
Thank you, Your Honor.
For help clarify. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I was just picking up on the same types of question. Ms. Moore, in the PPRP report, the storage report, I don't know if you have had a chance to look at it, but one of the things that is in there, it's on page 11, it states that utilities have identified a few cases where storage may be cost effective, but they also caution there may not be widespread need for storage projects to address distribution system issues in the near term. Are we just trying to create a reason to do this, or, I mean, we do know that the utilities, when there was clearly a need, like the Cold Springs Lane project, PG just proceeded and did it. No question about whether it was legal or anything. They just did it. Are there reasons to do this in a pilot, or should we be focusing our attention on the other uses of storage, which is behind-the-meter applications or other energy applications, such as what's being done near Warrior Run and providing services to PJM?
Okay, I'll try to answer that. I think one of the things this pilot tries to drive at is how to leverage those assets that are already being deployed or will be deployed for those other purposes to then also meet a grid reliability need. I mean, there's a couple of dynamics going on here. Number one, the price of batteries is going to continue to fall, and there will be a point where more and more applications of batteries as a grid reliability asset will be able to pencil it just because the price of batteries are falling, and we'd like to have more expertise in understanding how they're technically working on our system and what types of contracting we might have to enter with third parties and so forth. And so the pilot gives us an opportunity to learn about how to use storage on our system on a technical level, as well as giving us a lot of opportunities to learn about the different business models. I think also when you look at the business models that are put forward, some of them very much imagine exactly the types of applications that you're talking about, where the storage is being deployed behind a meter of, let's say, a CNI customer because they have a data center that has to know that they have backup power in case of any kind of an outage because, you know, they have sensitive load or so forth. And they're having a battery that's sitting there being used as backup only, and they could have a value stream by allowing the utility to have access to that battery as a grid reliability asset. This model would try to get at how we can find those types of opportunities, and in so doing, will probably create an incentive for more CNI customers to be installing these batteries behind the meter, because now the developers and the utility will be able to give them a better sense of other value streams that would be available to them that they probably aren't aware of at this time. So what we're hoping to get out of this pilot proposal is not only technical learnings on how the batteries work, but also developing those relationships with the competitive market and with those customers who are considering batteries as part of their solution behind the meter, to figure out where that sweet spot is where we can both leverage the asset to the benefit of ratepayers and to the benefit of that customer who chooses to deploy it. I think this kind of leads into one of the questions that was raised by one of the other panelists about concern that we would only be committing to the utility only model, the one where the utility owns and operates the battery and all the value streams, or, you know, owns the battery and uses it for grid reliability and then also operates it in the wholesale market. Honestly, in the conversations that we had with 7 of the leading battery installers in the nation, the ones who are executing these programs in New York, in Massachusetts, and all sorts of other places, what we learned is that the vast majority of the interest was in the VPP model. That's the very model where it's behind the meter for either a number of residential customers or for 1 or 2 or 3 commercial industrial customers, and the third party or the utility acts as an aggregator. To us, that's going to be one of the really interesting models to test out under this pilot program, not only for our sake, but also for the sake of our customers who might be contemplating investing in a battery right now, but for their only use of it as, let's say, backup power, it doesn't currently pencil. We'd be able to show them how there would be an additional value stream if they were cooperating with the utility for primary use of that battery as a grid reliability asset. So I think it's going to spur the market, potentially, this pilot program for those types of applications.
Okay. I guess I was looking for, that was a very broad answer, and I was really trying to get to the specifics of the PPRP report that indicated, at least in Maryland, there aren't, I guess, a widespread need for these storage projects. So I guess I'm still trying to get at why then should the unbundled distribution utility be getting directly involved if there aren't distribution purposes for this.
I suppose I would have to disagree with that conclusion that there aren't widespread needs. I think
this was a quote from the utility participants in the PPRP report. It said there were a few projects that directly defer or replace an existing or anticipated distribution need, but then it went on, don't get your hopes up, basically, because there aren't otherwise many opportunities. So
I'm just going to have to infer that the reason that was stated that way was because at the time the understanding is that there weren't many that penciled out solely as a grid distribution need. This pilot gets at exactly that point of, is there a larger opportunity to deploy storage if you allow your different mechanisms with different businesses participating with the utility, either as, under the different business models, to tap different value streams that would allow more of those to pencil.
Okay. And then the other question I wanted to bring up is, I think it was staff that proposed that maybe we limit further the 4 options to just 2 options, and that is look at the 2 non-utility owned options, and specifically on the virtual power plant, being that that's where it sounds like there's some real opportunities in a pilot situation to really learn. Did you have any comments on the staff recommendation on?
I think when you're doing a pilot that's looking at different business models, there's something to be learned by comparing different business models. And one of those business models that I think justifies understanding and learning is how much of the wholesale market revenues go directly to the benefit of ratepayers to reduce the impact of the cost of the battery if the utility is the one doing the wholesale transactions and using 100% of the resulting revenues to offset the recovery requirement, versus if you are using an asset that's coming from a third party is using in the wholesale transaction market and potentially taking some share of those wholesale revenues before the balance is used to offset the rate requirement. So you'd want to have, I think the utility one is the control in an experiment to test the other business
But
models.
I think staff's fear is that we'll have 8 projects that are presented and not one of them represent the virtual power project. And that's a possibility, is it not?
Well, I think the utilities all agreed that they would test 2 different ones.
Right, but they don't
So-
have, there's 4 to choose from, so.
So every utility, so theoretically you must have at least, I understand the concern that you could have 1 and 2, but to be quite frank, when we interacted with the technology providers, the one that that technology providers had the most resistance to was the second model, with the utility owning the asset and leasing it to a third party for wholesale transactions. I don't think we're going to get a lot of bites on that one, to be quite honest, given current wholesale transaction revenues and the size of these installations. Maybe in the future that would change, but given wholesale market right now, I don't think we get a lot of bites on that one. So I think you're going to get at least one of the other 2 models being tested.
Mr. Bonikowski, did you want to jump in?
I just wanted to clarify what our recommendation is. We're not recommending that only the third-party ownership or virtual power plant models be explored. We're simply recommending that for each utility, at least one of the proposed projects fall into those categories. So we would still have a baseline in the utility ownership categories to compare against.
Okay, my apologies if I read that incorrectly. If I could just finish by asking the Energy Storage Association, from the national standpoint, what are the opportunities in pilots right now for advancing storage into the distribution system and for other purposes? Where is the greatest value? Is it in the distribution side, or should we be looking at energy markets or behind-the-meter applications?
Great question. Commissioner Richard, we recently launched a report that looked at the outlook for energy storage through 2025. In that report, I believe approximately 40% of the growth will be in transmission and distribution asset, if that is helpful in terms of contextualizing. So of all the storage deployments, about 40% of them will serve to meet distribution and transmission needs.
Okay, so 60% in all the other areas then.
Right.
Okay. All right, I'll stop there.
Oh, thanks. A couple of my questions were tied along the same lines as what some of the other commissioners have already asked regarding the project types and the manner in which they were presented. They almost appear to be pilots within pilots. So there's several issues within each one of them that makes. I'm wondering how the work group thought the commission would be able to, or even the work group would be able to compare the success or failure of each of them. Because just as an example, developing the virtual power plant concept would require a number of components to go correctly in terms of finding a third party that's interested, making sure they have the full financial commitment and wherewithal to go forward with it, that they are able to interact correctly and properly with the utility to get all of the appropriate approvals and things of that sort, versus a utility-only version where the utility can handle a lot of that internally just because they have all the information already. So how do you define success for selecting or comparing the projects even within a service territory?
Just a clarifying question. Did you mean how do we define success? How do we compare across the four models, or just
Yes.
in general? I think that the overall the four models are intended to test whether there is a net benefit to ratepayers, as well as address a number of issues that are in front of you today around the ownership and competition in the provision of energy storage, issues around cost effectiveness of energy storage. So the way to assess how they compare is not only to determine whether there were net benefits, meaning the costs outweighed the benefits, but then what were the benefits, and do they justify a broader application of these models across the state?
So how do we ensure that the benefits that we identify can be replicated in a future project? So if we are successful, just as a virtual power plant example, Company A produces one that we think is successful. How do we know that Project B from Company B will be able to replicate the same result when there's so many factors underlying it that make it, how are we going to keep it working the same way across all of them?
Excellent question. I think that this is something that commissions across the country are dealing with and thinking about. For the virtual power plant, just to give a little bit of context, in the New Hampshire settlement that was just agreed on, the utility needs to be able to accurately predict its peak period by at a 75% rate for the pilot to be expanded beyond what's been approved. And the idea is that the utility would call on the resource, the customer-sided resource, and ask it to perform on a certain given day, serve certain grid application needs, or grid services needs. And so long as the utility was actually able to reduce their peak demand at a 75% accuracy rate, then the pilot would be able to be expanded to the phase 2. So I can envision a situation like that where you have some criteria and metrics for demonstrating that those VPP programs are actually providing their intended benefit, which is grid services and reducing peak demand. And in general, I agree that this is a very new and innovative approach. The benefits of being able to rely on third-party owned assets behind a customer meter to forego the need for distribution investment is so great and carries so much potential for ratepayer savings in terms of needing to invest in the distribution system, that I think that piloting it and thinking about ways to expand it beyond that are very much welcome here.
So is that same type of established goal setting, is that something that the other commissions and other states have done for the other types of projects that we have proposed here today?
I don't believe so.
Yeah. Okay. Are there other types of issues that perhaps the work group didn't consider that we should be paying attention to? And just as an example, in our community solar environment, we've seen a number of local governments have concerns and express concerns about the siting of the solar installations. Now, obviously, battery storage would not be as large, wouldn't take as much space, but are there other underlying issues that local governments, county governments, for example, community associations, somebody else that has expressed regarding the siting of storage or the placement of it, anything like that?
Yes, the Energy Storage Association has been actively engaged, not only with the PPRP in the drafting of the study, but also through the PC44 process here, including other working groups such as the interconnection working groups, to identify and productively work to break down barriers that exist in the state of Maryland for energy storage deployment. I'll also note that the 4 models that were selected for this proposal are not an exhaustive list of models that may serve a benefit to the state of Maryland, and I'm certain that other testimony today from companies will potentially highlight some other types of benefits and models, commercial models that could benefit the state of Maryland. We merely identified 4 that we think are widely deployed very much in need of further examination by this commission. Thank you.
And I guess the last question, this really could work for anybody. I'm not just picking on you, but regarding these as potential pilots, has there been a situation where the pilots have been concluded? So we've already seen the end of it, and there's been some analysis in terms of what happens with the equipment that was placed there, what happens with the data that was collected. Or is everybody still in pilot phase, or are there some that have already completed and have had a chance to analyze and move to another level?
Thank you, Commissioner. The two pilots I mentioned that are specifically targeting storage as a non-wires alternatives in New York and California are still ongoing. In New York, the first phase is completed, and they've actually expanded it and given authority to the utilities to go to market for even a second tranche. That said, there are many commercially cost-effective energy storage projects that are in the ground and have been running for multiple years across the United States that are not part of a pilot program, that have not only proven themselves in terms of the technology and the commercial and economic benefits of the asset, but have also tested some of these very models. So the pilots have not concluded, but there is a significant group of projects that we can lean on to get information on how effective those models are.
Thank you.
At this, sorry.
I'm sitting here trying to figure this out. So on the utility-only model, we're not talking about associating the storage with a solar facility or a wind facility. Is that correct? It's storage only, right?
No, it's storage for a grid reliability need.
Right.
So unless the grid reliability need is to balance solar that's already existing, I don't think it's envisioned to have.
So my question is that what energy are we storing? Where are we getting the energy that we're going to hold in the battery?
From the grid.
From the grid. And as part of our SOS contract? Because otherwise, where are we, is the utility engaging in arbitrage separate from SOS and then going to buy something that's not part of SOS and then sort of arbitrage that? I'm trying to understand where. I mean, I'm being very simplistic here. I'm not an engineer, so we have, presumably the battery is holding something, is holding energy over there until we decide we're going to release it and use it. But where are we getting the battery where are we getting the energy that is being stored? Is it part of the SOS contract, or is it something different? Because the utility only right now, as far as I know, buys SOS, right? And they run using SOS. Where's it coming from?
I'm going to defer to my colleagues on that one, because honestly, I don't know how to accurately answer that one.
I mean, and anybody else, I don't know if Mr. Bonikowski has a view on that. I'm just trying to figure out where's it coming from?
Does this mic work? Yeah. Yeah, this is Steve Sunderoff from the regulatory group of PHI. Yeah, our current vision is that it would be out of the wholesale marketplace, and directly off the wholesale market, real time.
Separate from SOS.
Separate from SOS.
Right, and so you would become, and is that, Mr. Cleaver, is that why we have a concern with the legal aspect, because they're engaging in the wholesale market in a way that's different than that's something other than SOS? Is that why you have a legal concern here?
That's part of it, Your Honor. I mean, if that was the primary purpose for the asset, or if it weren't a cost-effective alternative, and so that was what was driving the decision of the utility, then yes, that would be a part of the concern. The way we've come down on this issue, though, is that if the asset can be an alternative to a traditional T&D upgrade, but relies on those revenues to make it cost-effective, as far as the rate impact, we come down on thinking that passes statutory muster.
If using the revenues, it passes muster. It doesn't have to just rely on the replacing a grid asset. It can have replace the grid asset plus the revenues, and that still passes the test in your view.
Provided that the way that those revenues flowed through into rates would result in a cost-effective alternative as to just forgetting storage completely and doing it the traditional way. Yes.
Okay. And so with respect to 7509A1, which is your citation for why you think there is a legal problem,
Yes.
help me to understand, because looking at that law, it says on and after the implementation date, the generation, supply, and sale of electricity. So you're saying those are each separate items, that generation is separate from supply, is separate from sale under this statute, not generation and the associated supply and sale. Because
Yes.
clearly a battery doesn't generate anything. Right.
I read those to be separate.
You read those to be separate
discrete
items.
items, yes.
Okay, and if they were read to be generation, and then, the resulting supply and sale, then we might not have a problem, if one were to read it that way.
I see. So, Your Honor, your question is if the statute was really saying that it's just generation and the related facilities,
Right.
then I think we'd have even less concern if that's what the statute said than we do now.
Okay.
I agree with that. Yes.
Right, so because, I think, I'm not suggesting which one is correct, but I think that, since we're talking about the separation of generation and distribution, that if generation, supply, and sale all related to generation, then the battery issue becomes potentially less of an issue because it's not generating.
I think that's probably correct, Your Honor. Yes.
Okay, thanks. So when you're looking to this cost effectiveness issue, is there a problem, and I'll put it to anybody at the panel, if the commission were to say, hypothetically, we like the framework, but the framework can go forward, we don't want to see a project that is not cost effective, that all projects have to be cost effective. Is that a problem? Mr. Cleaver, does that solve one of your problems? Maybe not all of them, but one of them?
It solves one of them. Yes, Your Honor.
It solves one of them. Okay. And would the utilities have a problem with saying that the projects that would be part of any application would have to be cost effective?
I can't speak for the utilities on the spot by saying, yes, we'd agree to that, but I do know that my understanding is every one of the applications that we would bring forward, we'd be striving to have it be cost effective before we brought it forward, so I think it's consistent with what our goal would be.
Okay. So that particular issue would also solve, that particular possibility would solve the issue potentially about cost. Well, it doesn't solve the issue about cost projections, because if we thought we were approving something that would cost between $10 and $30 million and it came in at $300 million, it still doesn't really solve our problem, even if it is cost effective at $300 million. And obviously, these are just very large numbers and very large ranges, but just trying to figure that out. And my last question relates to something that Commissioner Linton talked about, and that is some experience we've had with the consumer solars. And this seems to me to be a very aggressive time frame. We've had a lot of issues with, we can't build this thing in that time, and we have to get financing, and we have to do this, and we have to do that. Is 1 year, assuming you would have to have it built in the first year so you could run it in the second year so you could evaluate it in the third year, is 1 year really a reasonable time frame in order to, once again, get the application done and construction and all that? Because we hear a lot of waivers about our community solar, and they're working on it, and there have been issues with respect to county local governments and having to get permitting done there. But there's also been construction delays. Would we anticipate those same kind of potential issues with construction, or is construction less of a problem with respect to building a battery storage versus
I'll try to
supply
answer
solar
that one.
facility.
I think my understanding of the timing that was set forth in the proposal was that in year one you would be putting forward the applications, and then year two would be bringing them to being operational. I think there's been some discussion about extending the data collection period beyond just year three, which I think we're amenable to. I think that where we're going to find the most complexity in the process is going to be in the contracting. That's where, in terms of working out the contracting between the third party and the utility on where the storage owner and the utility and the VPP model, or the aggregator and the owner and the utility. That's where the time constraint is going to be. I'd like to think that we'll get more elegant at that type of contracting as we go through the process. The first ones will be probably a bit tricky to work through. The construction itself on storage is very, very quick. If you think about what happened in California, where they were able to stand up, I don't even know the size of that solar or that storage installation that's at Aliso Canyon, but it was in 6 months.
3 to 6 months, yeah.
It much for a significantly larger storage installation than what we're talking about in any of these envisioned pilots.
Okay, I just want to make sure that we're not creating unrealistic deadlines and then having to come back and have to provide waivers and things like that because we have unrealistic deadlines.
Can I chime in on that, please? I think that the 3-year timeline determined in the proposal was based on a tension between wanting to have a robust data collection and an ample time for everyone to review the applications, but recognizing that we want a timely pilot that gets to the core issues that are needed to open up the energy storage market in the state of Maryland, and trying to strike the right balance between a timely pilot, but also recognizing technical staff's needs and project application deadlines. To Susan's point, in California, projects have been proven to be deployed in three months, and much larger projects than this. And so I don't think it's unreasonable to assume that if all of the regulatory and permitting and interconnection kinks are fixed, that projects can deploy really quickly. But I recognize the point that there may need to be more time. To staff's point, and I wish they had mentioned this in the working group, but we're open to discussing additional time for review, to data collection to make sure that you're adjusting for weatherization concerns. The key is just really to make sure that we're not dragging this on to the point where in 2025 and 2026, where there's potentially going to be, in the tens of gigawatts of storage deployed across the United States, that we are still deliberating a 10-megawatt pilot program.
That may be, but there's nothing prohibiting third parties or people behind the meter from doing that, and their storage will still be deployed in Maryland, whether there's a utility-owned process or not. Isn't that? Wouldn't you say? I mean, there's nothing that prohibits individuals and companies from deploying storage if it's in their interest.
Commissioner Herman, you're absolutely right that there are opportunities for wholesale market and customer-sited energy storage being deployed in the state of Maryland. But in recognition of the fact, my opening remarks, which is that really to pencil out economics, you have to facilitate multiple use applications for all assets so that they can capture various revenue streams. For example, for a customer-sited resource, being able to be called on to provide grid benefits, grid services, and being able to receive an on-bill credit for that creates an additional value stream in addition to demand charge mitigation, which will tip the economics in the favor of more storage assets. So while not every single model in this program is needed in order to see a wide deployment of energy storage in the state of Maryland, there are certain components, including clarification on ownership, which would be really beneficial.
Okay, thank you.
Good afternoon. Are you awaiting recognition
Yes, I am.
on this topic?
Well, I was really responding to some of the questions that Commissioner Herman and Commissioner Linton put forward. I don't know if this is the right opportunity.
Thank
or
you.
Later.
Actually, could you state your name and association
My
for the
name is
record?
Bernice McIntyre from WGL Energy. We put in reply comments, and we've participated in the working group.
Yes, Ms. McIntyre, if I could postpone your comments to a later section. We have some other participants that are on the agenda, and WGL Energy was not, but we will get you on the agenda.
Okay,
At this point, what I'd like to do is keep the panel here so we can continue asking questions. And I know the commissioners have more questions of the panel, but there are other voices that have notified us that they would like to participate. So I'd like to bring those panelists up to the two podiums, beginning with Potomac Edison and Sunrun. And if you could each speak for... oh. Yes. We're off the record for a moment. Did you register with the court reporter?
No, actually, I'm Teresa Harrell, Potomac Edison. We just came to answer any questions that any of you had. Teresa Harold, Potomac Edison.
Okay, so just answering questions.
Yes.
Okay, so why don't you have a seat then?
Okay.
And we know that you're here, and we appreciate First Energy and Potomac Edison's presence and participation. Okay, we are back on the record, so I'll bring, in addition to the Sunrun representative, Edison Electric Institute, if they wish to have comments, to the other podium, and we will begin with Sunrun.
Thank you very much.
Oh.
Okay.
Okay, we're back on the record.
All right. Thank you very much, Chairman and Commissioners. Good afternoon. My name is Nicole Cedar-Rahman. I serve as a Senior Manager of Public Policy at Sunrun. I've been an active participant in the PC44 Energy Storage Working Group since it started, along with my my expert colleague, Steve Rimsha, who is our Director of Grid Solutions. He's in Hawaii. He lives in Hawaii, so he couldn't make it today. But I just wanted to you have our comments. I wanted to just share some just additional thoughts related to why this pilot program is so necessary. And we have been getting very much into the weeds today regarding costs, regarding the different models that are being proposed. And just for the record, we are very enthusiastic about the virtual power plant model, as we believe that utilizing customer-sited battery storage really is the future for Maryland and can provide the greatest number of benefits for ratepayers. But I also wanted to just convey that the East Coast is moving really fast on the deployment of battery storage for consumers. And Maryland has a number of initiatives, legislative and other policy initiatives, considering battery storage. And it would just kind of be a shame for us to have spent such a long period of time working on this program proposal and not be able to move forward in an expeditious fashion. I think ratepayers expect that of all of us. Our customers expect that from us, that we be able to deliver advancement on deploying battery storage. And we are very supportive of both the working group process, very appreciative of Energy Storage Association's leadership. We've had great conversations with the utilities, and we're looking forward to figuring out ways that we can cost effectively move forward with testing out these models so that we can really build out the storage market in Maryland, because we are kind of behind other neighboring jurisdictions. My colleagues in New England recently had a fantastic win. An example of a virtual power plant that I wanted to share with you is we recently won a bid in ISO New England to deliver aggregated residential solar plus battery storage as a source of energy capacity in ISO New England. We're going to be able to provide 20 megawatts of energy capacity using Sunrun's Brightbox residential solar and battery storage systems beginning in 2022. And so it's a pretty historic achievement, but it's really about consumers and including them in the process of establishing greater grid resiliency and reliability. I've had a variety of conversations, not just with folks in the industry, but with community organizations along the East Coast, environmental justice organizations. People are thinking about battery storage as a vehicle for empowering consumers to be able to contribute to this larger grand vision that a lot of jurisdictions have around grid modernization. So there is, a great emphasis on what utilities are responsible for doing, what they're going to do, and what their plans are, but people want to be involved too, and they want how they use their energy or not, how they reduce their energy consumption, that to be included in the calculus for reduced need for distribution and transmission infrastructure and savings for everybody involved. So I wanted to just highlight that point, that people, the people that we serve, really want to be more involved and be considered meaningful stakeholders in a much more customer-centric way as we figure out kind of the best path forward for grid resiliency. So there were a couple of points that have come up that I wanted to highlight. I appreciate staff's recommendation, actually, that at least one of the options presented once you do approve the proposal, when the utilities and other stakeholders present more specific proposals that would include cost effectiveness estimates, that one of those proposals should be either the third party or the VPP option. We just believe that there are so many more benefits that customer-sided behind-the-meter resources can provide to a variety of players in the marketplace: consumers, residential consumers, utilities, the grid, just a variety of services that can be provided. And there was a conversation around well, I won't actually address, I'm going to go there. I wanted to just raise the concern that we have seen discussed around whether virtual power plants are legal or can function in a deregulated market. Our view is that virtual power plants kind of embody what competition is all about. And if we design the program, that particular model within the program, in a way that makes sure that the grid services side of battery storage is the focus of the proposal, then we would not be kind of running afoul of any kind of concern regarding generation or what have you. I actually think that VPPs, the growing partnerships that we're establishing with utilities, that really is kind of the heart of consumer choice and something that this commission should support and further. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Siddharaman, and thank you for filing those comments on behalf of Sunrun. Representative for Edison Electric Institute.
Good afternoon, Chairman and members of the Commission. Is this working?
Yes.
Am I too short?
You're good.
You can hear me? Fine. So my name is Lola Infante. I am the Senior Director for Clean Energy Technology and Policy at the Edison Electric Institute, the association that represents all of the United States investor-owned electric companies, including Exelon Utilities and First Energy. I really do appreciate this opportunity to express our support for the Energy Storage Work Group's Proof of Regulatory Concept Program proposal in its entirety. First of all, I want to thank and praise all of the parties for a superb collaborative effort. I want to stress that our support to the working group proposal recognizes and is based in part on this collaboration. In addition, I want to very briefly address some stakeholders' concerns regarding the inclusion of electric companies in the business models outlined in the proposal. As we look to transform our electric distribution systems, we agree with the goals of PC44 and you, the Commission, that it is important to find solutions that are customer-centered, affordable, reliable, and environmentally sustainable. Achieving these goals means, among many other things, getting to cost-effective solutions, and we talk about cost-effectiveness quite a bit this afternoon. For that, it is important not to presuppose that a business model that allows electric companies to own and operate energy storage assets, or that one application or set of applications will be less cost-effective than another. That is why we urge you to gather as much real-life information and accurate data as possible on all options presented. The results of the program proposed by the work group is likely to show that a model where electric companies own and operate energy storage devices is able to provide the type of customer-centered, affordable, reliable, and environmentally sustainable solutions that you're looking for Maryland customers. In the end, not even considering the option of electric companies owning and operating energy storage assets would, in our opinion, artificially limit the range of potentially good outcomes and solutions that meet all the goals of PC44. In sum, EI believes that ultimately the proposed pilot program will prove that the greatest value for customers will be attained by electric companies owning energy storage assets and operating them to provide all types of services in all value streams. The value of the program is precisely to test this hypothesis. That's why we hope that you will approve the proposal as it was presented to you by the working group, and thank you very much again for the opportunity to speak to you this afternoon.
Thank you, Ms. Infante, and thank you for the comments that EEI has also submitted and for participating here today. We have two more parties that would like to speak. I would propose that we bring them up, unless the commissioners have questions of the two parties at the podium right now, and then take a break closer to 3 o'clock, and then the commissioners will reconvene and continue any questions. Commissioner Richard.
Why don't I go ahead and ask my question now? I was interested in the WGL comment about the the possibility of affecting the competitive electric supply markets if we don't set this up right. I think the way it's stated, WGL Energy submits that this utility merchant role would adversely affect competitive electricity supply markets because storage technology is and will continue to become a very important economic element in competitive energy supply markets. And it goes on that it would be sound policy to let competitive providers test storage technology, incur development expenses, and offer storage products in competition with other competitive providers. And I'd just be interested to hear from Sunrun, as from the competitive side, and also from the Energy Storage Association, since you represent all the industry. Are there some parameters that we should be considering when we look at the various models? And I believe we've heard both from WGL and Sunrun. Sometimes I do mischaracterize individuals' remarks on exhibit today. But it sounds like the virtual power plant is a favored model by Sunrun and also, I believe, by WGL. And that goes along with, again, the concerns about adversely impacting competitive markets. So the Energy Storage Association, if you have a comment on that, since I assume that you represent the full breadth of the industry.
Yeah. I hope I understood your question correctly, Commissioner. I think that my first response is that the concept of this pilot is to create a space to test out some of these and glean learnings and identify whether there are potential impacts. So that is why this is a targeted, limited in size and limited in duration exercise in order to have answers to the kinds of questions that you raise exactly in this process of the pilot. The other thing I would say is that the reason why we've identified 4 models and the reason why those are in front of you today with some flexibility for the utilities to select 2 of the 4 is that while we recognize that those models work in certain markets, they may not work in others. And so to presuppose that one particular model is going to be, that there will be developers and cost-effective solutions that align with that model ties us to one specific solution that may not be attractive in Maryland for a number of reasons. And so providing an opportunity to test out the 4 models and coming back with 2 recognizes that in this time and this state and time, there may be some models that the market responds to better. So I certainly think that the virtual power plant model is extremely important, and I'm very pleased that it's in there. I'd like to see how the market responds to all 4 models, and then we can test out your questions around competitive markets within the pilot to determine whether there are any concerns or considerations that have to be in place more broadly beyond the pilot.
Okay, and I guess I'd be interested in Sunrun and obviously EEI, and then excuse me, does MEA, do you have an opinion on, again, competitive markets and getting the public policy right?
I think primarily, well, as I'm listening to virtual power plant, the conversation about virtual power plant models, I would have an actual concern, though, specifically about whether or not we actually have enough behind the meter storage here in the state in order to actually get enough of these out here. I'm not entirely certain how many would actually be required for this. But as far as I know about the virtual power plant model, it would essentially be a third party, essentially an algorithm that would be kind of lassoing these behind the meter materials, and then actually using that to discharge whenever it would be required. So from that perspective, if it's a third party company that's involved, and it's a third party algorithm and not necessarily solely owned and operated by one of the joint utilities, we wouldn't necessarily have a problem with that. But it's my understanding that we would have that third party involvement there that would actually be, let's say, accessing the wholesale market.
May I respond to just one thing that he just stated? I'm very glad that MEA is concerned about the deployment of battery storage for consumers in Maryland, and we have been having conversations with MEA about the current design of the tax credit program to make sure that all consumers, even those who do not own outright through cash, their battery systems can be able to participate in that program, and we're having very fruitful discussions about ways that we can further incentivize more customers of all income levels to be able to participate. And so we think that, the question of do we have enough, like we're kind of stalled right now in Maryland on a lot of fronts, solar and otherwise. Hopefully some good legislation will be passed this session. But I think that we're on a path to be able to really kickstart the market, and really this even though it is very preliminary, and you do rightfully deserve more information about cost effectiveness, this can be a really effective tool to get the market going and deploy more storage.
Thank you. At this point, we're going to change up the schedule. We'll take a brief break till 3 p.m., at which point we'll have Mr. Baron Shaw and the representative from WG Energy at each of the podiums. So we will brief recess until 3 p.m.
She runs their CN.
Before we get started, are there any additional parties aside from Mr. Shaw and WGL Energy that wishes to speak today? Okay, seeing none, we'll begin. We're back on the record. Good afternoon, Mr. Baron Shaw.
My name is Baron Shaw. Good afternoon, Commission. Thank you very much for letting me be here today. Every time that you let the public into a meeting, there's this one guy that you remember. I hope you remember me for the good reasons. I'm a little different than everybody else here. I'm not a professional advocate, a public relations representative. I'm not a lobbyist. In fact, I'm a professional fruit grower. Mostly apples and peaches. This is a picture of my daughter on the upper left there, a family that visits our orchard and some of the fruit we grow. I'm here today to put a face on some of the issues that this team and others have been working on very hard. And in addition to that, I'm here also to give you some other ideas that I hope you might find helpful. A year and a half ago, my family received a postcard in the mail stating that a company was considering construction of a high voltage line that would run through our area. I ignored it because I had lots of other things going on. A few months later, it all got real with us when there was a public input meeting where we discovered that large tracts of land like ours actually made us a target for transmission planners. And we found out at that point that we were in the crosshairs of a 230 kilovolt greenfield project that would go through our preserved farm. So my Pick Your Own Orchard is under threat of eminent domain from a new line that's called the Independence Energy Connection. The IEC is the first greenfield project proposed by PJM for purposes of market efficiency. So it wasn't really about reliability, it was more about market efficiency. And suddenly, I've become involved in the case of first impression that touches very closely to energy policy issues, like the ones you're discussing here.
Mr. Shaw, I would just like to caution you.
I understand what you're going to say.
We have an open proceeding with respect to the Independent Energy Connection, and we will be having public hearings on that. So if you could keep your remarks more general and
absolutely
outside.
Understand, and I kind of was pleasantly surprised actually that the whole commission was here today. It's wonderful. I'll skip ahead to the second sentence that was ahead. That was the IEC case is currently before the PSC and the PAPUC, and I'm not trying to present any testimony here today about that at all. So I will try to steer clear of that. Thank you. Rather, my goal is to make the PSC and stakeholders aware of big projects like this one that affect me, and put a face on it, like I said, and to talk a little bit about congestion and the effects that can have, and also to suggest some smarter ways to address concerns. So what I can point out that's certainly in the public record is that this project is an expensive project. It's right now in the neighborhood of $370 million with an AVRR of $500 million. So that just, from a public knowledge perspective, gives you an idea of how much money we're talking about. About 40% of that cost would be allocated to Maryland. So that background's important and pertinent to PC44 because, as you can see, the discussions you've been having about avoided transmission and decreased congestion, those are real things and they affect real people like me. They're not just theoretical benefits. So I'm heavily involved in the IEC case in both Maryland and Pennsylvania, and it's interesting to see how both states treat issues like this. In Maryland, it's very interesting that you've got several entities that don't exist in Pennsylvania. You have the MEA, you have PPRP, and you have a lot of dialogue going on in public conference like this about this kind of issue here in PC44. None of this kind of thing exists in Pennsylvania right now. The public policy issues related to this case are kind of left to the Commission to determine in a vacuum, and it's a little disconcerting, but hopefully they come to the right conclusion as well. So I'm hoping that the interest in policy in Maryland carries into action. I've read through the case history and the filings here in the Energy Storage Group, as well as some of the other groups going on in PC44, and a lot of people are agreeing with a lot of the things. So there's time of use rate setting, pre-programmed off-peak usage, even in the EV group, allowing electricity to go back to the grid from vehicles at times of peak need. But the biggest stumbling block so far, and I've heard it several times today here, is coming up with a case and a very specific case that lets you understand how much the benefits are going to be, and for that matter, how much the costs are going to be. So You probably see where I'm going with this. So what I know now is that the biggest gains from demand response and demand shifting, energy storage, all of these things, they're not uniformly spread through the region. In the last year and a half, I've done a lot of research on these things, and I know a lot about congestion now. And a lot of the big benefits that can be made are made only if the effort is placed in the right location at the right time. You can think of it as a lever, actually. If you exert the right amount of benefit in the right place, it can have an outsized effect. And that's what I want to talk about now, maybe some specifics. As you know, PJM only has one tool in their tool belt to try to solve problems, and that's suggesting new lines. They can't suggest new generation. They can't suggest innovative new products like what you've been talking about today. So it's my hope that the PSC sees this kind of Swiss Army knife as a tool in their tool belt to be able to address problems like the one that I have. Specifically, there are some reliability concerns that PJM has put forward. The graph that I have right here, without going and boring you about a lot of the details, gives you an idea of some of the capacities we're talking about. The line that they've suggested building through my farm would have a capacity of 2,400 megawatts, so that's the big bar there. One of the lines that they have a concern for capacity out in 2023, some time away, is this Lincoln-Straben line. And it has a very small capacity of something like 154 megawatts. And if you do the math to figure out how much it's congested, it's even a smaller amount. It's something like 39 megawatts, and that's the maximum size that congestion might be. It's very likely to be smaller than that, and I can't figure it out because I don't have access to the power flow models. But other people do. So this would be an example of a case where if you increase generation downstream of that, and from a downstream perspective, that would be in this area around Germantown and south, Westminster, say. If you were to come up with 39 megawatts of generation, or decrease the load, or shift the load with storage, you might be able to help make this project go away. And we're not talking about small amounts of money. It's 150 to 200 million dollars that the ratepayers would be on the hook for if this project went through. And that's a small reliability concern they have, but then they also are concerned about congestion. PJM states that IEC is good for LMPs in the Washington, D.C. area no matter what the time of the day or the year, and generally that might be true because natural gas fracked electricity out of Pennsylvania is somewhat cheaper. But most of the time, the spread is much higher during times of peak demand, and those are the times that drive the historic periods of high congestion costs, and that's where your idea of stacked benefits comes so much into play. Because what if there wasn't only demand response incentives to lower consumption during those periods, but also incentives in storage systems to shave those peaks by shifting that demand down a little bit? So I know that the group's already discussed how those LMP savings can flow back to the owners of the batteries or whoever that might be. But my suggestion would be that we also monetize the cost avoidance of projects like this one, because it makes a whole lot more sense to spend a little bit of money and get a great big gain out of it than spend a lot of money and get a little gain.
And I think you heard from the joint utilities earlier today that part of that cost-benefit analysis, whether we do it at the program approval stage or at the specific project stage, should capture some of those other non-monetized benefits here.
Yeah.
So is it safe to say, Mr. Brown, that you are in support of
I am
the
in
proposal?
I am in support, and I'm at the end of what I wanted to talk about. The only other point I wanted to make was that if you hear anything else from me here, that location matters in some of this stuff. If you build a solar facility in the Delmarva Peninsula or Cecil County or stack a lot of capacity out there, you might be exacerbating the congestion problem because all of that power needs to flow across the top side of the Chesapeake, and there's really only one backbone up there that moves it. It's the Peach Bottom Conestone line. So as you think about siting these things, make sure that you site them in places where they're helping to solve a problem rather than creating a new problem. Because the last thing you want to do is to have PJM say, oh, by the way, you've created a congestion problem and we need to build new lines. And it's going to cost you money. So that's what I'd ask you to consider also. So,
Thank you, Mr. Shaw.
thank you very much.
For somebody who specializes in owning an orchard, I think if you wanted a new career as an electrical engineer with PJM, you may be qualified.
That was my last my last job was as an engineer. I moved back to the farm in my old age.
That makes a lot more sense. Thank you for your comments and input. The representative from WGL Energy, if you'd like to take the podium or sit in the seat.
Come here. I think it makes it easier for the transcriber. Good afternoon. My name is Bernice K. McIntyre. I represent WGL Energy. And thank you for the opportunity to talk. We didn't expect to put in oral testimony today, but we did put in comments, and because a couple of the commissioners raised issues that just I felt like I needed to say something in response to.
The comments, I might add, were very thorough, and I wish I would have read them first because it provided a summary of all the other comments.
Sure. Well, you can thank our in-house counsel along with our team, my team, for putting those together, and we appreciate the compliment. One of the reasons I think WGL Energy is in a different position than many of the players here is because WGL Energy represents actually two business models. The first is WGL Energy Services, which is a marketer of gas and electricity in Maryland, but also in 5 other jurisdictions. We're now in Ohio. So that's one competitive service we provide. The second is that we provide solar and other distributed generation, including energy storage across the country. So that makes us a, a generation providing entity. And I think because of that unique sort of perspective, because we do both sides of the house, we even internally sometimes come in to have detailed discussions in-house about how we would respond to a particular project. Obviously, the energy storage provides opportunities for third-party providers of generation assets to enter that market and do that behind the meter, as we do presently. But when the utility wants to enter the market for storage, it does create some wrinkles. And the two comments that I wanted to respond to was, first, Commissioner Linton, when he talked about the fact that how does the ESA expect the Commission to compare the 4 models that it's offered. And he talked about the nuance or the layering, because there's businesses within businesses that would deliver the products that you would see there. And I think that's a legitimate issue, and I think it's one that, I'd just like you to focus on as to how you would evaluate and compare the cost effectiveness or the success, as I think Commissioner Linton talked about, when you're comparing those projects. The other comment was Commissioner Herman, when she talked about OPC's comments and WGL Energy's comments around whether or not energy storage was a generation asset. I think earlier on, the representative from ESA made it clear that we've got a very different type of entity or a different type of tool when we're talking about energy storage, because it can provide benefits that look like generation, that look like distribution, that look like transmission. And I think that fundamentally this Commission has to really look at providing some guidance to the marketplace if you were to approve a utility storage facility, of how you would define it being used as a distribution asset. I think Commissioner Herman, you indicated that when the utility is buying the supply, is it doing it under SOS, or would it be buying it in the market wholesale? And I think the answer that came from one of the utility representatives is that they would be providing it wholesale or buying it wholesale. That has implications to the WGL Energy Services side of the house, where we're buying electricity in the open market and competing against other players in that market. And I think that's also a nuance that needs to be looked at, as well as, what kind of a competitive impacts there are with the utility providing energy storage for those companies that actually do to provide generation assets like a solar provider or others. There are very complicated questions here, and I don't really have answers. We do have some red flags that we raised in our comments, and we will let them speak for themselves. But I wanted to respond to both of those comments. The other thing is, I think the representative from ESA, when she was speaking, made, I think, a very good point. There are 4 models that were given, and not all models work the best depending on the regulatory regime that the project will exist in. And I think that some thought should be given to that. Obviously, WGL Energy has some concerns about utility using energy storage for wholesale generation type purposes. So with that, those were the comments that I wanted to make, and I really appreciate the opportunity you gave me to respond to the comments that I heard from the bench.
Thank you, Ms. McIntyre. Do commissioners have questions of Ms. McIntyre? No. Thank you. Well, we will resume our questions of the first panel, and commissioners reserve the right to ask questions of those who participated from the podiums as well. Commissioner O'Donnell.
So, Ms. Moore, I wanted to ask you a question about what happens. First of all, let me ask you a basic question. Do you agree that we should clarify what the 3-year period or whatever ends up being, 4 or 5 years?
For the data collection?
For the data collection, what that purpose is for the sunset. There was a suggestion in one of the commenters that we should clarify that.
I think some clarification would be helpful, yes.
So assuming we get to the end of the evaluation, we have the data, and the data tell us this thing doesn't work, doesn't make sense, isn't useful, and we've invested a lot of money in it, and it's amortized over a long period of time. I'm specifically speaking about option 1, the utility-owned asset. Then what happens? We can't use it. Didn't pan out. Didn't work the way we thought. Because any test is really testing. You don't know ahead of time. At the end of that period, what happens then? What happens to the burden on the ratepayer?
I'd like to try to answer that by saying, number one, that from a technical perspective, we're quite confident that energy storage will work as a grid reliability asset in place of traditional assets in certain circumstances. And we are constantly going through the process of looking at our systems across our utilities, looking for opportunities where we've identified a grid reliability need and testing those grid reliability needs against the use of storage as one of the tools to address it. I don't think we'd be coming forward with a proposal where we're not confident that the asset works from a reliability perspective.
So these pilots, to me, are proof of concept tests in the field.
I think the pilots are...
You're telling me that it can't fail. It won't fail. It's not going to fail.
I'm not going to make an absolute statement that it'll never fail, but I think we're doing very due diligence to make sure that we are not suggesting that storage be deployed where the system works.
I would suspect that you would, and we would anticipate that you would, but my question is, what if it isn't? What happens?
For the pilots to be responded to in a robust fashion under any of the business models, I think there has to be some degree of certainty that that asset has a life of 10 years, I think, is what we're envisioning for it. If it doesn't matter if it's a utility installed storage or a third party installed storage that's contracted for the utility, for people to come forward, there has to be some confidence that over the period of time of that 10-year life of the asset, they'll be able to recover their costs in some fashion, either through continuing the contract or through recovering through rate base. I think what we're trying to test in the business models is the impact of being able to access the other revenue streams to reduce the impact of that initial investment by whoever.
So I agree with all that.
Right.
But my question line really is getting to who carries the risk on this stuff. It's a test. We're going to go out and test it. We have a high degree of probability, even though we don't know how much it's going to cost, and we don't even know what the specifics are yet. But who's carrying all the risk? Do the investors in the utilities have risk in this game, or is it all carried by the ratepayers?
I think as we envision the pilot program going forward, the asset would go into rate base in the case where the utility owned it, or the contract that the utility commits to for access to someone else's asset would go into rate base. So under that supposition, the risk does sit with ratepayers.
Okay, so I appreciate you getting there with me. It took a while, but I appreciate it. And that puts a point for me on the importance of having cost data up front, so I know what I'm getting into and where I'm heading. So I had to. It was a tough way to get around the rose bush, but we got there. The ratepayers are going to bear the risk, and I think we need to keep that in mind when we go forward with these tests. You're dying to say something.
Commissioner O'Donnell, your questions are spot on. I would like to underscore a component that I don't think has been discussed today, which is the mobility of energy storage, particularly advanced energy storage technologies and batteries, particularly when we're talking about 1 megawatt size projects. There is an ability, and it's being used across the states, to move an asset once its deferral benefits have been exhausted. So for example, you may find that you can deploy a 1 megawatt storage asset at a substation to defer an investment for 5 years, but at the end of those 5 years, you end up doing something more, doing the initial investment. You've created value by optionality of buying those 5 years' time to determine whether the load growth is there. You can actually move that asset to a different part of the grid fairly easily and then use it for another need. And so while these assets will be in the rate base, and I recognize and share with you the concern about ratepayer impact, I do think that the mobility of these assets, particularly projects this size, provide an option for utilities and stakeholders to re-envision what that asset will do at the end of the program if you've determined that that's not the right location for it.
I appreciate that, and certainly there's opportunities here in my mind. But what I do want to point out is that this is different than regular plant going into rate base, because that plant has to come in for a prudency review after the money's spent and it's invested in, and we have to determine prudency and whether or not we're going to allow cost recovery on that. This is pre-approval of cost recovery in rate base, and it's a very different animal. It's not just rate base stuff. It's pre-approved rate base, whether it works or is used and useful or not. And I think we need to be honest about that when we discuss this.
Commissioner O'Donnell, if I could follow up on that point. I know that in Potomac Edison's comments, they said it would be premature to commit to any particular rate base, so they split from the joint utilities in that respect. Can you explain why your proposal is correct and their argument is incorrect, or why you don't agree with their argument that it's premature at this time to determine what the cost recovery mechanism should be? And if Potomac Edison, if I misstated your position, feel free to grab the microphone.
Yeah, I don't know what their thinking was behind why they've decided that it's premature. I think a lot of the recovery methodologies that we are envisioning might be applied in this pilot are being tested in other markets like New York and in California and so forth. The my recollection is that the proposal doesn't put forward a particular approach in terms of saying that it has to be, that there's an incentive based on savings, or there's a higher rate of return on a contract, or any of those kinds of particulars that are worked out when in something like New York Rev, when an application comes forward. I think we've allowed ourselves, in the way the proposal has been put forward, room to be able to figure out the right revenue mechanism specifically for a particular application and business model when we come forward with the application, and that's an area of discussion and stakeholder engagement and commission questioning when we come forward with a specific application. I also think that's the point at which there's going to be a lot of discussion about the prudency of the approach being used.
Just to add on that, the examples I gave earlier on the microgrids, that's where the things fell apart. The proposals did not get approved because there was enough sharing of expectations up front.
And I would read from the Potomac Edison comments. They state that, quote, due to the lack of clarity associated with the ultimate cost of these projects, we recommend that the cost recovery methodology for these projects be determined as a part of a subsequent review and proceedings. End quote. Would Potomac Edison prefer to explain, and I think this is quite clear, but why you disagree with the joint utilities in this respect?
Absolutely. Teresa Harold, Potomac Edison. I think we do not disagree with any of the specific cost recovery methodologies in the joint utilities comments. We want to see the solicitation results, however, before we commit to a specific cost recovery methodology. I think we believe there are going to be different revenue streams, different costs associated with the solicitation results. We don't know what the ultimate project will be at this point. So from that perspective, we think it's premature to commit in this generic proceeding to a specific cost recovery methodology for each of the particular projects.
I tend to agree with you. So Ms. Mora or Ms. Goldberger, can you explain to me why her argument is not one that I should buy as a commissioner on this panel? Why should we wed ourselves to a particular cost recovery mechanism at this early stage as opposed to step number 2?
I'm going to ask that one of my colleagues answer, who's closer to the recovery mechanisms that we use in Maryland.
John Frayne for BG and the joint utilities. John Frayne. So I would say that I don't believe that the joint utilities are actually asking for a determination on a specific cost recovery methodology today. I think we are asking for a determination on sort of the conceptual framework that we're talking about here and to move forward. And we did mention the idea of, that it's important to place these different business models on a level playing field to, make sure that when the utilities are looking at the different options that the financial incentives work out, that they're on a similar level. But we're not asking today, right now, for a predetermination on what that cost recovery methodology might look like.
Okay, well, thank you, Mr. Frayne. If that's your position, I don't see any daylight between your position and Potomac Edison. And we'll just call it a day there. Other questions?
Yeah, one more.
Commissioner O'Donnell, back at you.
Ms. Goldberger, I heard you say earlier that, and I forget what the specifics were, but you said you wished that the working group had had more direction from us. And that was early in your opening comments. It was a particular point you said we wish we had more direction from the commission on this.
Actually, direction from OBC about timing, or the commission staff?
Commissioner O'Donnell, yeah, I think that what I said was in response to technical staff's request for modifications of the timeline of the proposal, that I would have benefited from receiving that feedback as we were drafting the proposal prior to submitting it to you, so that we can better accommodate considerations for approval and review timelines.
It wasn't a trick question. I can go back and read the transcript.
Yeah.
We got that.
No.
But really, my question will work then as a follow-up. Are there more things, and I'll open this up to anyone who wants to answer it, are there more things that the working group could benefit from by seeking guidance from the commission for a phase, maybe a second phase of this proceeding, as the chairman alluded to earlier in one of the other group's comments.
Commissioner O'Donnell, I think that the one area that's come up today on the panel and in the discussions of the working group is this notion of how to make a utility whole for going with a third-party owned asset. So I do believe, and just from my experience with other pilot programs, the ultimate decision on the mechanism by which to use was determined by the commissioners themselves rather than the working group. That is one area where I think additional consideration from the bench would be useful.
And that's the point that I asked the judge about earlier on with regard to the three options. Okay. All right, very good. Anything else? Would it be helpful for us to give you direction on other things that are unresolved? Maybe the judge could weigh in on
I think the working group might appreciate the opportunity to present a slightly revised proposal that incorporated staff's recommendations that I think now have consensus. They could also add some language to clear up. I think someone was looking for clarity with regard to the sunset. I think that can be fairly easily resolved as well with some language. So if it would benefit the commission, the working group would certainly be amenable to presenting a revised proposal to incorporate some of those positions where I don't think there's really a dispute.
Might it be an opportunity to present some clarification of the cost-benefit discussions we've had today and some cost parameters?
And I think this panel has heard, I think it'd be fair to characterize concern by a majority, if not all, of the commissioners with respect to the lack of any even rough analysis of the cost and benefits of this proposal. If I was in the position of the sponsoring utilities, I might see this a different way, asking why the commission can't wait to see when we actually have the contours of actual projects, when we could provide a more accurate estimate.
I think if I heard Ms. Goldberger correctly, she was willing to provide publicly available information on costs of projects in other states. I don't know what public information is available on the benefits and the revenue streams. That might be more limited. But if she's still willing to do that, there is maybe perhaps more information that could be provided. I don't know how much public information is available on the projects, not pilot projects, but the projects that exist in Maryland, the Chesapeake project, any of those projects. I don't know if public information is available, but if it were, we could.
We have Cold Spring as one example. That I know there are a few others, perhaps. Well, the Mosaic project may be a little different, and Fluence has their project as well. And also recognize that the utilities, the four utilities, likely have some sense of the outer limits of projects that they would like to develop. Maura.
Yeah, if I could just make a quick comment. I mean, I think that I would love to work with ESA to further look at some of the examples that are already out there in other states so we can get some parameters on existing project costs for other projects that might be using these models that have, similar size. I think one of the things that is important in considering the costs of these is that when we talk about the business models other than, maybe 1 and 2, and we start getting into the business models for 3 and 4, where the asset is owned and operated by other parties than the utility, a lot of the cost is going to be associated with what the contract is. The contract price is that they charge the utility for access to that asset. And that's something where I think we can talk again to the competitive companies that we spoke to glean their interest in executing those models with us. I think they're going to be very hesitant to give us what the contract price would be for access to their services or to their resources in a non-protected way, because it would affect the competitive nature of them then competing for those bids in the future. So I I think we can do some work to try to get some better parameters around cost, but I do have concerns, and I just want to flag them in advance, that a large part of the cost estimate discussion is going to be dependent not on the utility, but on third-party competitive suppliers who are going to be very hesitant to move forward with cost information. That's why there's a degree to which when they're responding to an RFP, they're going to be able to share more of that information because it's protected in certain ways.
I recognize that, but at the end of the day, these are going to be little projects. We're going to have at most 8 of them. 8, potentially 5 megawatts, up to 10 megawatts. So these are going to be relatively small projects. We have Florida Power and Light and Arizona Public Service rolling out these huge 100-megawatt projects here. But right now, at this point in time, I don't have any confidence whether or not these 8 projects are going to cost $100,000 each. 100,000? Probably not. 100 million? I don't know. So I don't believe any of the parties that have expressed concern, as Commissioner O'Donnell said earlier, we're going to hold you to these numbers, but we have to have some better sense of what we're looking at here. And if it's $100,000 for 8 projects, I think I'll be inclined to support.
Well, and in addition, if these are ratepayer-funded projects, these are projects where the cost will come out. We cannot, if ratepayers are paying for them, we cannot keep these contracts a secret. So if people want to have a ratepayer-funded project, which seems to me to be a pretty sweet deal, then they might be willing to give you some numbers, because it's not something that can be kept secret. We can't, as much as they might like to keep something secret, if the ratepayers are paying for it, I have a very difficult time keeping that a secret, how much they're paying. I'm not sure that's even possible. But to the extent, so that's another reaction to the, well, we're not going to get decent pricing. Well, if we can't get decent pricing, we can't have any idea. One of the alternatives, I'm not saying that's where the commission goes, is to say, if you don't tell us how much it's cost, we can't do it. So, it's kind of it's something for folks to keep in mind that, we're asking for some estimates that we're not holding anybody firm to, but some within a range. And so, you suggested that these things can be moved, these storage units, that if they're 1 megawatt, it can be moved. Does that mean it fits on the back of a semi? Is that the kind of size? I mean, to tell you the truth, I don't even really have a full understanding of, are we talking about something that sits on the back of a semi, or are we talking about something that sits on the back of 6 semis? What are we talking about here?
I'd be happy to follow up and share more information about this, and I'm sure that the utilities can provide you with better color on the projects, but these can be containerized projects that are in just a big metal container.
Mm-hmm. Right, that's what I'm trying to understand, because that helps us understand what kind of size and scope we're looking at, what kind of construction we're thinking about, all of that, and it's really just to give us an idea of what you're asking for.
Commissioner Herman, I'm happy to follow up with more information on what that would look like, particularly related to mobility of these assets.
Okay, thank you.
And it is safe to say that these projects will probably be in the neighborhood of 1 megawatt or smaller? Yes. Okay. Thank you.
Just following up on that same point, some of the descriptions of what the application description, I think it's on starts on page 12 of the original January 2019 proposal. And just in giving a nod to Mr. Shaw's comments earlier regarding the potential location of a storage project and then what it could be used for, I think some further explanation as to what some of these bullet points mean would be helpful. I mean, for example, one of them is technology type. I know there's more to it than that, but I'm not sure exactly what that means within the context of a application description that somebody's going to have to look at and make some decision on, and that somebody could be me. So I'd like to have a little more understanding of that. And for project location, just as an example, what is it relying on? Is it relying on resiliency, reliability? Is it the hope that the choice location will allow the greatest use of commodity purchase on the wholesale market? I mean, why is one location more necessary than another one? Is it to relieve congestion? I don't know. So anything that to help us understand a little more about what's actually being considered by parties before they choose to even submit a proposal for consideration to a utility would be helpful. So.
Yeah, I would add that I think it would be helpful to have just understanding how the alternative, the storage alternative, contrasts to the cost of what the standard or approach would be. So if we're talking about deferring projects or voiding projects, what is the cost there? I mean, that it could be looked at as the cost to the cost to avoid, and then I think the analysis of the storage project could talk about both directly what its cost would be, and then some of the stream of benefits that I think were referred to earlier, the things that, in addition to taking care of what's being avoided or what's being deferred. Same for when we're talking about voltage or frequency support. Again, what are the traditional approaches from the distribution planning versus how the storage would play into that, and then I think those are some good costs to compare.
Can I ask a clarifying question? I think in response to both of the points you both commissioners just made, and that's all information that I think we envision bringing forward with a specific application in terms of the location, the technology selected, the application in terms of it's for grid reliability or it's voltage control or whatever it is that was being envisioned as the use for the storage asset. What you're suggesting is that at this pre-application point, when we're giving you the parameters for the larger program, we give you a sampling of those types of generic categories so that you have a better sense of the kinds of projects that we're envisioning. So the location would be part of a specific application, and that would also dictate what the exact need is in that space. Well, the need comes first. The grid reliability need is identified. That tells you the location. It tells you the size. It tells you the technology that you have to use to solve it. What you're asking is that in this proposal point, we give some general, more granular detail than what's in the proposal now, but capturing some of those concepts?
Yeah, for me, okay. That's what I would envision, and also perhaps having a standards up front that you would not bring to us a project that did not have a positive cost-benefit analysis outcome. So that's I guess what where I'm going.
Yeah, no, I would agree with that. I think it was helpful just to even hear now that you suggested that it was the project location would be based on grid reliability. So that means that it's not necessarily, I mean, it could be reliant to congestion, but there might be another option or reason why a location that could have also relieved congestion in a different area wasn't selected. And so it's useful to have some understanding as to what the rationale would be for choosing a particular project location. Because in the end, when we try to evaluate, was it valuable? Was it cost effective? Was it worth the value of the money that was spent to actually put it together? It's important to know in the beginning why the choices were made when we evaluate it at the end.
I fully agree, and I know that was something that we envisioned putting forward in each of the applications we brought forward for a specific pilot project. I'm trying to figure out how we would capture some of those generic categories, and we will try to do so in the program proposal itself.
Let me just add, since you asked for clarification, and we've all been hitting on this all day long pretty much. Yes, the answer to your question is yes. We would expect more broad data. We know you're not going to have finely honed cost estimates. And as I said earlier, it's not something, I'm not looking for something, speaking for myself, that I'm going to be able to hold you to later in terms of your forecasting capabilities. Because we will, I think, hold you to the finely honed cost data that you do bring forth in the proposals when they come later, and we will then have an expectation that you're going to meet those. But right now, at the programmatic level, we need to have a sense of what we're talking about, and we don't.
So, is there anything in the proposal that requires that the cost effectiveness or that the rationale for putting the storage in is more, is let's say 50% of the reason we're doing this is for the grid or for congestion or something, we're going to, because we're going, more than 50% of the cost is going to be offset, it's going to be offsetting a distribution or transmission upgrade, and then the rest of it we'll get from the wholesale market. Or is it possible that you could put one in, you could propose one that goes in, and 95% of the cost effectiveness is coming from the wholesale market? So, because what think I've heard you say is that we're doing this for grid reliability, but the only way, one of the ways we make it cost effective for grid reliability is to stack on the benefits, stack on the other benefits from the grid and offsetting system improvements, that sort of thing. So what I'm trying to understand, is there any sort of a ratio, and from staff and People's Council and MEA, do you think a ratio of value effectively, is that something that we should be looking for, so that we can make sure that this is not purely arbitrage, and it's more for the grid, and then there's an extra added benefit on top of that's what it benefits the grid more so than just playing the wholesale market. Do you all have an opinion on that?
Speaking for staff, I think that would be an effective criteria. It would basically be a risk threshold that you could set. The purpose of this pilot one of the purposes is we're trying to assess what the magnitude of these alternative value streams is, if it exists. And so by basically having a set percentage of it be in a known value stream, we can insulate ratepayers from the risks that these projects may inherently possess. I think that would be valuable.
Right.
Commissioner, I think, excuse me, I think MEA would potentially take issue with any access to wholesale revenues using rate-based asset. However, having said that, I would probably have to take it back for internal review to see if we could do any type of ratio like you suggest.
Okay, so you would be in favor of utility-owned storage only if it is just purely offsetting costs on the distribution transmission system.
Yes.
Okay. Mr. Cleaver, you have a view?
Yes. Thank you, Your Honor. We haven't really considered it in those terms. Our consideration of it was simply, overall, looking at the overall picture and accounting for those other revenue streams. Is it cost effective? But I think you raise a good point, Your Honor. And if I understand your concern, you would be concerned with just a really crude hypothetical. If a traditional upgrade would cost $100 and the storage asset would cost $500 to build, but the expected revenues from the wholesale markets were $600, therefore making it more cost effective. Your Honor, your question, the underlying part of your question is that would present a concern that such a high percentage of the value, so to speak, would be coming from some other revenue stream other than the avoided cost of the transmission. Is that what?
Right. I think as Mr. Bonikowski said, does that reduce ratepayer risk by saying that we know that if they place a battery here, it's going to delay an upgrade, a system upgrade for 5 to 7 years, depending on the growth, and that has a present value of $100, and that therefore, so we know we've got at least $100 coming in. We know that, and then to the extent they can use the battery in the wholesale market to increase that above the $100, that at least we've got the $100, so that at least a portion of it is focused on system reliability and system benefiting the system.
Yeah, I think that's a good thought, Your Honor, and we, as I understand that, we would, I don't think we'd be opposed to that, but we would ask for, time to consider that internally. But sitting here now, I think that's a good idea.
Sure, and I'm just trying to understand if that's possible, and two, if Mr. Bonikowski is correct, does that reduce ratepayer risk? And so I'm just, curious about that. So, Ms. Moria?
Yeah, I'd love to respond to that one. I think, I always get a little nervous about hypotheticals, but using these hypothetical numbers, I think the way that we had been picturing it is up until now you've discovered a grid reliability need that the traditional asset would have been $95 and the battery solution is $100. And we're wondering if we can use it in the wholesale transaction market, if we can make it, $10, and that means that we split this, it costs less effectively because it brings down the price of the battery to $90 versus the $95. Those are the kinds of imagined scenarios that we've been moving forward with. Or if you went on with that hypothetical, the traditional solution cost $100 and paying a contract to a third party who's aggregating a couple of batteries at C&I customers gets you the same access to assets that meet the same need for $70. It's there. You've already seen that you're contracting for access to someone else's assets, and the contract payment is less than the traditional solution. I think requiring that a certain amount of the value come from the grid reliability purpose is consistent. I'd have to go back and make sure everybody's okay with and I think it's in how it's constructed, but I think it's very consistent with what our thoughts had been about the types of opportunities we were trying to target for this type of pilot. Our concern with storage right now is that in many cases, it's right on the edge of being competitive with the traditional solution. And if you install it, if it does pencil and you install it, you use it maybe 5-10 days a year for peak shaving, and the other times of the year it's not being used for anything. And if we could use it in other ways or lease it to someone else to use in other ways and take the full benefit of those lease payments or those transactions and put them to the benefit of ratepayers, it would make that storage a really economic alternative to the traditional investment, and everybody would come out better off. And so that's what we're trying to get to. We predicate every one of our targeted projects on finding a grid reliability need, understanding what the traditional investment for it is, and trying to find some way to make storage work against that. And so I think that's consistent with where our thought had been on it, and maybe that having that kind of a percentage that would be tied back to the value as an alternative to a traditional solution would be something that would be helpful to contextualize that in other folks' minds in terms of understanding what the value proposition really is to ratepayers, not to the utility, to ratepayers, because we're looking at trying to find a way to minimize the cost, not only of storage to ratepayers, but to grid reliability solutions to ratepayers using storage.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions of the panel? No. Well, thank you. I think we've come a long way today. I recognize that this proposal has been around since the end of 2017. I want to thank all the work group participants and our new work group leader for pushing this along. I recognize that Maryland is not a leader right now in energy storage, and I'd like us to get there. However, today we're not going to be making a ruling from the bench with respect to the proposal that we have before us. I would ask the work group leader, Judge Lawrence, to continue working, particularly on the cost effectiveness issue, and to re-bring that proposal before the commission. There were some other concerns that were raised by MEA, Potomac Edison, People's Council, and staff today. I would also ask all the parties to take a second look at those concerns. I'm under no illusion that this likely cannot be a consensus It'd be ideal if it was, but may not, at the end of the day, address every single one of the issues that Mr. Cleaver, Dr. Opsahl, and Mr. Bonikowski raised with respect to the proposal. But I think we could. There's some room. There's some additional details that Ms. Goldberger committed to providing today, and hopefully we could move forward in a relatively quick fashion once we see the revised proposal. So with that, I would ask Judge Lawrence if there is any other information that you need from the bench today before we adjourn.
I don't believe so. I think the direction that's been provided will be helpful, and we'll reconvene and get that revised proposal to you as soon as possible.
Well, again, I sincerely appreciate the work of all the folks sitting at the table today, as well as those who also contributed either oral comments today or written comments today. Thank you, and this meeting is now adjourned.
Thank you.